Not every case is remembered because it was unsolved. Some are remembered because the evidence was wrong. In November 1974, police in Lancashire stopped a group of men traveling to Belfast after two devastating explosions had just torn through Birmingham city centre, killing 21 people and injuring 182 others. The officers expected to find frightened travelers, perhaps witnesses who had fled the chaos. But when forensic tests were conducted and interrogations began, authorities believed they had found something far more significant: the bombers themselves, caught mere hours after the deadliest attack on British soil since World War II. The men were arrested, questioned, and within days, 4 of them had confessed to participating in the bombings. The case seemed solved with remarkable speed. Justice, it appeared, had been swift and certain. At the time, this was accepted as conclusive. And yet, what investigators, journalists, and even judges would discover over the next 16 years was far more troubling than anyone initially imagined. The people at the center of this story were 6 ordinary working men who had left Northern Ireland for Birmingham in the 1960s, seeking employment and stability in England's industrial heartland. Hugh Callaghan, Patrick Joseph Hill, Gerard Hunter, Richard McElkenny, William Power, and John Walker ranged in age from their early 30s to their mid-40s. 5 were born in Belfast, while Walker hailed from Derry. To their neighbors and co-workers in Birmingham, they were unremarkable figures: laborers, family men, part of the large Irish community that had settled in the Midlands. Some were described as quiet, others as friendly and sociable. They attended work, raised their families, and lived what appeared to be entirely conventional lives. But there was one detail about these men that would later be twisted into something sinister, something that authorities would use to construct an entire narrative of guilt. They all knew James McDade, a young IRA member who had accidentally killed himself on November 14, 1974, when a bomb he was planting at a telephone exchange in Coventry detonated prematurely. This connection, knowing a man who had died in an act of terrorism, would become the thread that bound them to one of the most controversial cases in British legal history. Meanwhile, on the evening of November 21, 1974, Birmingham city centre was alive with its usual Thursday night energy. The Mulberry Bush pub, located at the foot of the distinctive Rotunda building, and the tavern in the town, a basement establishment on New Street, were filled with people. Friends gathering after work, couples on dates, strangers sharing drinks and conversation. At approximately 8:25 p.m., the normalcy of that evening was obliterated. An improvised explosive device detonated at the Mulberry Bush, followed 2 minutes later by another explosion at the tavern in the town. The force of the blasts was catastrophic. 10 people died at the Mulberry Bush, 11 at the tavern in the town. Windows shattered across the city center. The injured, 182 in total, were rushed to hospitals across Birmingham, many with life-altering wounds. As emergency services flooded the area and the nation reeled from the horror, police immediately began working to identify who was responsible. The Provisional IRA was the obvious suspect. The organization had been conducting a bombing campaign across England, and McDade's recent death in Coventry had created speculation about potential retaliation. Earlier that same evening, 5 of the 6 men who would become known as the Birmingham Six had boarded a train at New Street Station, the same station near one of the bombing sites, bound for Belfast via Heysham. They were traveling to attend McDade's funeral, a fact they initially concealed from authorities, fearing it would make them look suspicious. Hugh Callaghan had remained in Birmingham that evening, not traveling with the others. When the group reached Heysham, Lancashire, sometime after the explosions had occurred, they encountered a special branch stop-and-search operation. This was not unusual. Security was heightened for anyone traveling between Britain and Northern Ireland during this period. But on this particular night, as the search was underway, police received word of the Birmingham bombings. Suddenly, 5 Irish men traveling to Belfast to attend an IRA member's funeral became subjects of intense scrutiny. The men agreed to be taken to Morecambe Police Station for forensic tests. It was a decision that would alter the course of their lives, though at that moment, they believed cooperation would quickly establish their innocence. When the men arrived at Morecambe Police Station in the early hours of November 22nd, they noticed an atmosphere that felt different from a routine questioning. Officers were tense, focused, and the initial forensic testing was conducted with unusual urgency. Forensic scientist Frank Skuse performed what were known as grease tests on the men's hands, a procedure designed to detect traces of nitroglycerine, a component of explosives. When Skuse examined Patrick Hill and William Power, he claimed to have found positive results. The tests on Callaghan, Hunter, McElkenny, and Walker came back negative. For Hill and Power, this finding would become the cornerstone of the prosecution's case against them. Skuse would later testify that he was 99% certain that both men had handled explosives recently. The science was presented as absolute. Inside the interrogation rooms, the atmosphere shifted from procedural to accusatory. The men, who had initially been cooperative, now found themselves treated as suspects in mass murder. They were questioned about their movements, their relationship with McDade, their politics, their reasons for traveling to Belfast. On the morning of November 22nd, after hours of questioning in Morecambe, the 5 travelers were transferred to the custody of the West Midlands Serious Crime Squad at Queen's Road Station in Aston, Birmingham. Hugh Callaghan was arrested separately that evening and brought to the same facility. What happened next in those interview rooms would become the subject of fierce dispute for decades. According to later testimony from the men themselves, testimony that would be dismissed, challenged, and eventually vindicated, the interrogations at Queen's Road were brutal. The men claimed they were deprived of food and sleep, sometimes questioned for 12 hours without breaks. They described being punched, having dogs released within inches of their faces, and enduring mock executions designed to terrorize them into confession. William Power said officers from Birmingham's Criminal Investigation Department assaulted him. Richard McElkenny's daughter would later recall seeing her father the day after his arrest. He had been so badly beaten he was unrecognizable. Under this pressure, confessions began to emerge. Power had already confessed while still in Morecambe. At Queen's Road, Callaghan, Walker, and McElkenny also gave statements admitting involvement in the bombings. These confessions varied in detail, and the men would later claim they were entirely fabricated under duress. But at the time, from the perspective of investigators, the case appeared to be coming together with remarkable efficiency. They had forensic evidence, the grease tests. They had confessions. They had motive, the men's connection to McDade and, by extension, to the IRA. No further questions were asked. The path that had begun with a routine stop and search had transformed into something irreversible. The 6 men were no longer travelers or witnesses. They were accused murderers, and the machinery of the British justice system was now in motion. For a moment, perhaps in those cells, perhaps during brief intervals between interrogations, the men must have considered that the truth would eventually prevail, that their innocence would be established through proper investigation. But the door to that possibility was closing. The confessions had been secured. The forensic results had been interpreted. And in the climate of fear and anger that followed the Birmingham bombings, the public and the authorities were desperate for someone to hold accountable. On May 12, 1975, the 6 men were formally charged with murder. 3 other men, James Kelly, Mick Murray, and Michael Sheehan, were charged with conspiracy in connection to the case. The trial began on June 9, 1975, at the Crown Court sitting at Lancaster Castle. Mr. Justice Bridge presided, and after legal arguments, the statements made during the November interrogations were deemed admissible as evidence, despite the men's claims that they had been coerced. The prosecution's case rested on several key elements. First, there were the confessions, which the defendants now repudiated, claiming they had been tortured into giving false statements. Second, there was Frank Skuse's forensic evidence, his assertion that Hill and Power had handled explosives based on the grease test results. Third, there was circumstantial evidence provided by Thomas Watt about John Walker's alleged association with provisional IRA members. The defense brought in their own expert, Hugh Kenneth Black, of the Royal Institute of Chemistry and former HM Chief Inspector of Explosives for the Home Office, who challenged Skuse's conclusions. Black argued that the grease test was unreliable and that numerous innocuous substances, including soap, cigarettes, and playing cards, could produce false positives. But Justice Bridge clearly favored the prosecution's version of events. The jury, deliberating in an atmosphere of national trauma and public anger over the bombings, found all 6 men guilty of murder. On August 15, 1975, each man was sentenced to 21 life sentences, one for each person killed in the bombings. The case, it seemed, was closed. On November 28, 1975, just months after their conviction, the 6 men appeared in court for a second time. They had been remanded to HM Prison Winson Green following their trial, and when they were brought before the court, observers were shocked by what they saw. All 6 men bore visible signs of severe ill treatment, bruising, cuts, and other injuries that told a story of violence within the prison walls. 14 prison officers were subsequently charged with assault in June 1976. However, in a trial presided over by Judge Graham Swanwick, all 14 were acquitted. The official version remained unchanged. In 1977, the Birmingham Six brought a civil claim for damages against the West Midlands Police, seeking compensation for the alleged torture and coercion they had endured during their interrogations. The case made it to the Court of Appeal in 1980, where it was heard by 3 senior judges: Lord Denning, Master of the Rolls, Reginald Gough, and Sir George Baker. In a decision that would become infamous, Lord Denning struck out the civil claim under the principle of estoppel. His reasoning was extraordinary. He wrote, "Just consider the course of events if this action is allowed to proceed to trial. If the 6 men fail, it will mean that much time and money will have been expended by many people for no good purpose. If the 6 men win, it will mean that the police were guilty of perjury, that they were guilty of violence and threats, that the confessions were involuntary and were improperly admitted in evidence, and that the convictions were erroneous. That would mean that the Home Secretary would either have to recommend they be pardoned, or he would have to remit the case to the Court of Appeal." This is such an appalling vista that every sensible person in the land would say, it cannot be right that these actions should go any further. In other words, Denning was arguing that the implications of the men being innocent were so disturbing to the credibility of the British justice system that the case should not be allowed to proceed. The possibility that the men were telling the truth was dismissed, not because the evidence favored the police, but because accepting their truth would reveal systemic failure. For the Birmingham Six, another door had closed. In March 1976, the men's first application for leave to appeal was dismissed by the Court of Appeal, presided over by Lord Chief Justice Widgery. But outside the courtroom, doubts were beginning to emerge. Journalist Chris Mullen, working for Granada Television's World in Action series, began investigating the case. What he found troubled him deeply. The forensic evidence seemed questionable. The confessions appeared to have been extracted under duress. And there were troubling gaps in the prosecution's narrative. In 1985, the first of several World in Action programs casting serious doubt on the men's convictions was broadcast. In 1986, Mullen published Error of Judgment, The Truth About the Birmingham Pub Bombings, which set out a detailed case supporting the men's claims of innocence. Most significantly, Mullen claimed to have met the 4 men who were actually responsible for the bombings. The pressure was mounting. Home Secretary Douglas Hurd referred the case back to the Court of Appeal. In January 1988, after a 6-week hearing, at that time the longest criminal appeal hearing ever held in Britain, the convictions were ruled to be safe and satisfactory. Their appeals were dismissed. The courts had spoken twice. Over the next 3 years, newspaper articles, television documentaries, and books continued to bring forward new evidence. Public opinion was shifting. In December 1989, Irish Taoiseach Charles Haughey raised the case directly with British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, requesting that it be reopened. Thatcher refused, but the evidence continued to mount. New scientific analysis called Frank Scuse's forensic work into serious question. Gas chromatography mass spectrometry tests showed no traces of explosives on Power and contradicted the initial results for Hill. Additionally, evidence emerged suggesting that police had fabricated and suppressed evidence. In 1991, the case returned to the Court of Appeal for a 3rd time. Gerard Hunter was represented by Lord Gifford, QC, while the others were represented by Michael Mansfield, QC. Crucially, the Crown chose not to resist the appeals. Based on new evidence of police fabrication, successful attacks on the confessions, and the discrediting of the forensic evidence, the prosecution acknowledged that the convictions could no longer stand. The Court of Appeal stated, "In the light of the fresh scientific evidence, which at least throws grave doubt on Scous's evidence, if it does not destroy it altogether, these convictions are both unsafe and unsatisfactory." On March 14, 1991, 16 years after they were convicted, the Birmingham Six walked free. Years later, when researchers and journalists continued to examine the case files, several overlooked details emerged that reframed the entire story in disturbing ways. The men themselves had always maintained that the actual bombers were never caught. Chris Mullen's investigation had led him to 4 men who he believed were responsible. Members of the IRA who had planned and executed the attack. Mullen had promised these sources confidentiality, and he maintained that promise even as pressure mounted on him to reveal their identities. In 2016, during an inquest into the bombings, Patrick Hill stated that he knew the identities of 3 of the bombers who were still free men in Ireland. In 2019, a witness testified that the real bombers were Mick Murray, James Francis Gavin, Seamus McLaughlin, and Michael Hayes. Mullen confirmed that Murray, Gavin, and Hayes were 3 of the 4 bombers he had revealed in his book, but refused to identify the 4th, the young planter, who was still alive. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation was not about who committed the bombings, but about how the justice system had responded when confronted with evidence of its own failure. The case revealed that multiple levels of the British legal system had either participated in or turned a blind eye to a miscarriage of justice. The appalling vista that Denning had feared was not the possibility that innocent men had been tortured and wrongly imprisoned. It was the possibility that acknowledging this truth would damage the credibility of British institutions. The men had been caught in a system that valued its own reputation over truth and justice. Superintendent George Reed and 2 other police officers were charged with perjury and conspiracy to pervert the course of justice, but were never prosecuted. In 2001, the 6 men were awarded compensation ranging from £840,000 to £1.2 million. The Birmingham Six left prison as different men than they had entered. 16 years of wrongful imprisonment, of being labeled as mass murderers, of watching their families suffer under the weight of that stigma, had taken a profound toll. Richard McIlkenny returned to Ireland shortly after his release. He died of cancer on May 21, 2006, at the age of 73. Hugh Callaghan lived to the age of 93, dying on May 27, 2023. Patrick Joseph Hill died in his home in Ayrshire, Scotland, on December 30, 2024, at the age of 80. As of 2011, Gerard Hunter resided in Portugal, John Walker in Donegal, and William Power in London. Each had sought to rebuild his life far from Birmingham and the memories of what had been taken. The Birmingham Six appeals, along with other miscarriages of justice, forced Britain to confront serious flaws in its criminal justice system. In 1991, a Royal Commission on Criminal Justice was established. The commission reported in 1993 and led to the Criminal Appeal Act 1995, which established the Criminal Cases Review Commission in 1997, a mechanism that might have freed the Birmingham Six years earlier. The case also affected press freedom. After their exoneration, the Birmingham Six sued multiple publications for libel, receiving settlements from the Sunday Telegraph, The Sun, and others. They also sued Conservative MP David Evans, who had publicly stated they were guilty. Evans apologized, paid damages, and promised never to repeat the allegation. Systems had changed, but the damage could not be undone. In 2018, the West Midlands Police reopened the investigation into the Birmingham pub bombings. They sought to compel Chris Mullen to reveal all his sources. Mullen cooperated to the extent he felt was ethically possible, but refused to identify the 4th bomber, arguing that source protection is fundamental to press freedom. In March 2022, Judge Lucraft ruled in Mullen's favor, finding it was not in the public interest to compel him to identify the living perpetrator. The Birmingham Six case remains one of the most significant miscarriages of justice in British legal history. It is a story not of one failure, but of systemic, repeated failures at every level of the justice system. 6 innocent men were tortured into making false confessions. Forensic evidence that was fundamentally flawed was presented as scientific certainty. Defense experts who challenged that evidence were dismissed. Trial judges favored prosecution narratives over reasonable doubt. Appeal courts initially refused to examine new evidence that challenged the original convictions. Senior legal figures openly stated that protecting the reputation of British institutions was more important than establishing the truth. And throughout it all, the actual bombers, the men who planted the devices that killed 21 people and injured 182 others on that November evening in 1974, remained free. The case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, about institutional self-protection, and about the vulnerability of individuals when systems prioritize their own credibility over truth. Two groups of people were bound together by the Birmingham pub bombings: the innocent victims who died or were injured in the explosions, and the innocent men who were tortured and imprisoned for crimes they did not commit. Both groups were failed by those who should have protected them, failed by bombers who showed no regard for human life, and failed by a justice system that was more interested in appearing infallible than in pursuing truth. The story of the Birmingham Six is not about clever twists or shocking revelations designed to entertain. It is about the fragility of justice when institutions refuse to acknowledge their own capacity for error. It is about ordinary men caught in extraordinary circumstances, fighting for 16 years to prove what they had always known: they were innocent. And that is the story that deserves to be remembered. If you're interested in carefully researched cases like this one, you can subscribe to the channel. New investigations are released regularly. If you have thoughts about this case or details that stood out to you, feel free to leave a comment below.